The article discusses the impact of the loss of bison on the Blackfeet Nation and other indigenous peoples in North America. It highlights how the decline in bison population led to economic hardships and a decrease in height among indigenous populations in the late 19th century. Ethics. Indigenous. Proxy. Counterparts. Extinction. Reverberate. Agglomeration. Portents.
Right at the top of Montana is a stretch of land bigger than Delaware. It's the Blackfeet Reservation, and it's bordered by the Rocky Mountains shooting up on one side and wide open plains on the other. And it's there that Irvin Carlson lived on his grandparents' cattle ranch in the 1950s and 60s.
I grew up ranching. It taught me to work hard, to be able to work hard and for a living and work ethics. It was a good way of growing up.
But across the reservation, across Blackfeet Nation, work was scarce.
I didn't see a whole lot of jobs. There was a lot of unemployment here, not a lot of opportunity for all of our people here.
And new evidence has found that the persistently high unemployment in Blackfeet Nation is particularly severe among Indigenous nations that once relied on one animal. This is The Indicator from Planet Money. I'm Darian Woods. Today on the show, the devastating story the numbers tell us about the people once reliant on bison. Don Fair is an economist at University of Victoria in Canada. And a few years ago, Don was working with a couple of other economists on a research project that involved trying to estimate how well off Indigenous North Americans were in the 19th century. But economic data was pretty hard to come by for that time. One measure of economic well-being, perhaps a proxy for income, was how tall people were back then.
We knew about this data that was collected in a very ambitious initiative by Franz Boas, who's a famous physical anthropologist, on the biological height of about 15,000 Native Americans across North America. So we found it, the data, acquired it, and when we started to do the analysis, that's when we saw major declines in height, right? So that is when it started to really hit us that this was a disaster.
The disaster was the loss of bison. For over 10,000 years, many peoples in what's now known as North America had relied on bison. 30 million of the creatures stretched from Canada all the way down to Mexico. And to people like Evan Carlson's ancestors, the bison, or the American buffalo, were family. It was a part of their way of life.
Buffalo were everything to us, well, actually our economy. Buffalo was our lodging, our clothing, our food, tools, parts of our ceremonies. That's how we survived, was on buffalo and with buffalo.
And when Don Fair looked at that height data, they saw that the people who hunted bison had a massive height advantage in the 19th century. They're among the tallest people in the world, taller than Europeans or other indigenous groups who weren't reliant on bison.
About 2 centimeters on average taller.
About an inch taller than their European counterparts.
Oh, yeah, definitely. No, these were very tall people.
That height was because of good nutrition in their childhoods, but those advantages started to slip dramatically in the 1870s.
In 1871, there was a change in European tanning technology that all of a sudden made bison hides commercially viable in Europe when they hadn't actually been before. So this change in technology created, you might have heard of a gold rush. Well, this created a hide rush. And settler hide hunters flooded to the Great Plains, Rocky Mountain regions, where the bison were in the thousands and slaughtered the bison in the millions. There's really horrific stories, and I'm sure many people have seen classic images of settlers standing next to a pile of bison skulls, far taller, 3 times taller than they were. And in some areas of the country, there was more violence. So you might know the Indian Wars. But once the U.S. military realized what was happening to the nations when they were losing the bison, the American military started to participate in its slaughter as well. And then it became an intentional destruction. So depending on the region, we went from millions of bison to virtually none or a few hundred within 5, 10, or 20 years. So this is a very dramatic change.
Livelihoods for nations like the Blackfeet vanished. Some communities had to eat their horses. They ate rotting food. Some even ate old clothing. And other economic options were limited. I mean, for one thing, the US government restricted Indigenous peoples' movement well into the early 20th century. And getting bank loans to start a business, well, that was challenging. And Don could see this in the health data.
There was increased child mortality, signs of maternal distress. People born after the slaughter and during the slaughter started to be much shorter than their ancestors who had relied on the bison. And in fact, by the end of the slaughter, the Indigenous people who had been at least like an inch taller actually lost their entire height advantage.
The US government would end up providing food and other support and encouraged nations like the Blackfeet to get into farming. The nations themselves also collected bison bones to sell for fertilizer. But Don and their co-authors found that these initiatives didn't bring bison-reliant people back to where they were economically compared with other Indigenous groups.
When we started to do the analysis, that's when we saw the major declines in height, right? So that is when it started to really, really hit us that this was a disaster. I mean, it's a disaster, right? It's a near extinction of a brilliant creature that societies relied on. But beyond that, you could actually just see in the data the impact it was having on Indigenous people. And once we saw that, we knew that we had to tell this story because the data wouldn't deny it. And beyond that, we were able to show all the way until today, statistically controlling for many other factors, bison nations today, their income is at least 25% lower than that of all other Indigenous nations in the US.
You saw how this could reverberate to today, and that seems like an extraordinary finding.
It's actually not. Many economists have actually started to show that the distribution of economic activity today doesn't rely on modern fundamentals only. So history can impact the development of regions, right? So many economists have showed this in other contexts. Features that were important for economic development historically, like, for example, like water routes for trade, right? Those have an impact on where cities form. Even though you no longer use much of the time anyway, the water transportation like we used to, they can still shape passive development through agglomeration, right? If people are there already, more people are going to go.
I guess that's why I'm in New York, is because of the agglomeration that once was driven by the ports and the Erie Canal that no longer is as important.
Exactly. And again, New York isn't going anywhere just because their importance declined over time. So there's something similar going on here, but what we're talking about is actually the loss of a resource. It influenced desirability of people both to go to these regions. So if there was very little economic activity happening, other people wouldn't necessarily go there to trade, because what are you going to trade, right? It didn't have to be this way, but history has played out such that this shock has persisted. But it didn't have to. If you had access to other resources to re-specialize your economies, like access to banks, you might have been able to recover.
Don and their co-authors find that nations that had more banks near their territories fared better. They were able to borrow and invest in, say, new factories.
If you imagine that all of a sudden all the oil and gas resources just vanished and you made people in Texas stay in Texas, and then you took away a few of the banks, what do you think would happen over time to Texas and the people there?
Back in Blackfeet Reservation, there's hope for the future. Irvin's been working to bring back bison. They have a herd of about 800 that are mostly fenced in.
It's a big thing with us nowadays, and even helping economically, of them helping taking care of us in a new way as they did in our beginning.
Earlier this year, Irvin helped with an effort to release bison to roam freely in the mountains.
That was the greatest success. That meant a lot to me. It was a very moving time for a lot of our people that were there after so many years. Seeing that release back onto their homelands was very, very emotional and very welcomed.
This episode was produced by Brittany Cronin with engineering by Robert Rodriguez. It was fact-checked by Sarah Juarez. Kate Cannon edits the show, and The Indicator is a production of NPR.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Spectrum Business. Spectrum Business is made to work the way small business works. That's why Spectrum Business provides internet, phone, and mobile services that are made to work as hard as you do. Learn more at spectrum.com/work.
I was coming into my own as an athlete. I had my first girlfriend. I'd done really well my freshman year of high school. I had a 94 GPA. I was in advanced classes with all of my friends. But there was a shadow hanging over me that summer, and that shadow's name was Mad Dog Martin.
That's Aaron Todd, and on today's episode of The Howl, your arch nemesis challenges you to go beyond. From NCPR and the Adirondack Center for Writing, this is The Howl, true stories, no notes, live on stage in the North Country. I'm Ethan Shanty. When I graduated from high school, all I knew is that I wanted to become a writer. And like every teenager who spends his free time reading, I too knew that I would write the next great American novel. I took every writing course that I could at SUNY Potsdam, but I didn't find that anything was particularly challenging. So I thought, well, damn, I guess I'm pretty good at this. And then I met the Mohawk poet Maurice Kenny. He was SUNY Potsdam's writer-in-residence, and right away, writing became a lot harder. I was doing, honestly, my best Stephen King impression, and for him, it just wasn't good enough. He took away all my swear words, and he said, I'm not kidding, he said, you can have them back when you learn how to use them. He made me write and rewrite. He'd sit in front of me during office hours and recite the good parts of my prose, making me hear how they could sing, and then he would cross out the bad stuff in big, bold red pen. Coming up on the end of my junior year, I was starting to get short stories under my belt, and he told me next semester, I'm teaching poetry. I told him, thanks, but no thanks, Dr. Kenny. You don't understand, he said. You have no choice. I think about those words a lot now, more than a decade later. You have no choice. Because for as much as I protested and as much as I was determined to prove that I couldn't write poetry, now I really don't feel like I have a choice in the matter. I feel compelled to write. I have to. So today I've written 2 books, and it turns out that I'll probably never be the next great American novelist, but instead, I'm a poet, and that's okay with me. I discovered that even though it might get your blood boiling, when someone tells you to do better, it's often coming from a place of love. Aaron Todd told us this story live on stage in Saranac Lake, and it really hits close to home.
When I was a kid, it was really easy to sort people into heroes and villains. And as I've grown older, I've realized that the waters are a little more murky. Heroes have flaws, and villains often have noble motivations. Sometimes the difference between a hero and a villain is merely a matter of perspective. And it's with that lens in mind, I'm going to ask you to travel back in time with me to the summer of 1993. And I know time travel isn't possible, but for those of you who are parents, it often feels like it is. I have a 15-year-old son, and as I watch him navigate high school, I see him walk along this knife's edge of being confident and being cocky. And it's like he's holding up a mirror and saying, Dad, remember, this is you. And, you know, that's a really interesting experience to have. I was a confident, more cocky kid than my son. My son was confident, and I'm cocky, and I was cocky. And I had a lot going for me at that time. I was coming into my own as an athlete. I had my first girlfriend. I'd done really well my freshman year of high school. I had a 94 GPA. I was in advanced classes with all of my friends. But there was a shadow hanging over me that summer, and that shadow's name was Mad Dog Martin. Now, Mad Dog sounds like your typical high school bully, and let me tell you, that was not the case. Mad Dog stands about this tall. And it turns out that she's a woman in her 50s. So Mad Dog was my high school English teacher, Jill Martin. And she had a reputation. She was the strictest teacher in school. She was the hardest grader. She had super high expectations, and I was a little intimidated. In fact, she started my summer off a little bit. It was a tough start to my summer because I'd gotten a letter in the mail that said, welcome to my class. Here's a list of books. Please read one. And I said, this is my summer. You are invading my summer. This is my space. And I was really upset about it. But I said, you know what? First impressions are really, really important. So I'm going to pick the longest book on this list, and I'm going to show you. So I read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. And I knew I had to do an oral report, so I started putting it together. And I wrote this sweeping narrative about the Joad family's journey from Oklahoma to California, their escape from the Dust Bowl, their survival through the Depression. And I felt like it was good, but it wasn't quite good enough. So I found a CD that we had in the library, Ken Burns' Civil War series. It'd come out a couple years earlier. So I set my whole speech to this song, and I timed it to the second. I had every word set in every measure, and I was so proud of this. And I said, I am going to nail this, and I am going to be smooth sailing for the rest of the year. So it comes a day for my presentation, and I get up and I press play. I bring the boombox with me from home, press play on the CD player, and the music begins, and I deliver the best damn speech Canton High School has ever seen. And I can't wait to get my grade because it's going to be this great vindication of what an awesome student I am. And a couple days later, I get it back, and it's got a red 85 with a circle around it. Now, an 85 is not a bad grade, but I was like this, perfectionist, and it was just so disheartening. I thought, if I delivered the best damn speech that Canton High School has ever seen, and that's only an 85, what can I possibly do? Well, the year only got more challenging. Mrs. Martin assigned 80 to 100 pages a night of A Tale of Two Cities. I mean, it was a challenge just to get through every day. But there was an end in sight. In June, 10th grade would end, and I would have a new teacher for Advanced English 11. Only I didn't. Assignments were changed, and suddenly Mrs. Martin was going to be my teacher again in 11th grade. We actually had a third of the class drop out from the advanced track. We went from 24 to 16. But I stuck with it. I said, no, I'm not going to let this woman deter me from my plan. I am going to stay in the advanced track. Well, somewhere along the way in that year, she introduced a unit on journalism. And she said, I want to produce an issue of the school newspaper. It hadn't been done in decades. And she asked me to be the sports editor. And so I jumped in. And it turned out I loved it. And she trusted me with more and more, and we started working on this. We put out an issue, and it was amazing. I loved every second of it. And then at the end of the unit, she said, I'd love to keep doing this, but we have other things to cover. If you want to continue to work on the newspaper, we're going to have to do it after school. And so a number of us did. And I found myself in the hour between when classes ended and when my track practice began in Mrs. Martin's room, discussing story ideas, talking about interview techniques, and doing layout. And that spring, I had a decision again. A lot of my friends took AP English and took the AP exam to earn college credit. And I decided to take electives in journalism and public speaking because Mrs. Martin was teaching them. She encouraged me to pursue an internship with the Watertown Daily Times. I worked in their sports department throughout high school on a part-time basis and in college. And I ended up having a 20-year career in sports journalism and in athletic communications and marketing. And while, like many of us over the COVID pandemic, I had a change in heart in what I wanted to do with my life, spending every night and weekend in a press box rather than home with my family became more and more challenging. So I changed careers. But one of the benefits of my new job is they've given me the freedom to teach a sports writing internship at St. Lawrence, where I continue to teach college students many of the lessons that Mrs. Martin taught me. Now, I know I established at the beginning time travel is not possible. But if it were, first I'd go back about 8 minutes ago and fix all my little omissions. But then I'd go back 30 years and I'd talk to myself and say, Aaron, it's an 85. Get over it. I know you want to find a villain in this story, but the villain in the story isn't Mrs. Martin, it's you. And 30 years from now, you're going to be on a stage in front of hundreds of people, and Mrs. Martin will be in the audience. And you get to tell her what a hero she is to you. Thank you.
That's it for this week, folks. Thanks so much to Aaron for the story, and my advice to you, when your English teacher tells you what to do, you better listen up. The Howl is written, produced, and edited by me, Ethan Shanty, with editorial supervision by David Summerstein. Live audio is captured by Doyle Dean, Bill Hanel is our digital guy, and Caitlin Kelly handles our social media. Music on today's episode is by famous letter writer of Plattsburgh. The Howl is a co-production of NCPR and the Adirondack Center for Writing in Saranac Lake. You can find more episodes of this show and support the program, plus find out when we're going to be telling stories in your town by visiting ncpr.org/howl. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.